thanks so much for joining us. In this episode, we meet former federal public servant Michael Manthorpe PSM. Michael's career has taken him from some of the most junior to one of the most senior ranks of the federal public service. He was a departmental deputy secretary, and in his most recent and final appointment, Michael was just the 10th person to be appointed Commonwealth Ombudsman. Michael was awarded a Public Service Medal in 2010 for, quote, outstanding public service in contributing to the Australian government's response to the collapse of ABC Learning Centres Limited in 2008, unquote. Now, for people who aren't used to APS language and to understand Michael's achievements, and without embarrassing him too much, in 2015, Michael was just one of 3 public servants across Australia to be awarded a scholarship to attend an executive education program at the Harvard Kennedy School, the world's leading school of government. The other 2 recipients that year, one of them went on to be the Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and is now Governor of South Australia, Her Excellency the Honourable Francis Adamson AC, and the other person is now the Commissioner of the Queensland Police Service, Katarina Carroll, APM. I met Michael back in 2001. It's a lifetime ago, and he was a branch head in a government department, and I was a political advisor in federal parliament working in the office of the then minister who oversaw that part of the department which Michael was in. Michael was candid, he was humble, quietly self-assured, and clearly he had the respect of people more senior to him in the department and the minister's offices. He was one of those people that you meet as you go through life and you hope to yourself that they'll end up hitting their career out of the park, as Michael has. Now, at the outset, and this is important, this discussion is about leadership broadly. It's about Michael's reflections on leadership, the leadership he's seen, and the leader he has evolved into. And while, understandably, there may be an interest into some of the high-profile subject matter that Michael was involved with over the years in various ways, that's for other people to consider. This discussion is about the principles of the Australian public service, what good governance is, and those ideals and what they meant to Michael, how he has lived them over those 3 decades of service, and for me to see what the person I knew 20 plus years ago was like now. I'm indebted to Michael for his time and to the Institute of Public Administration, ACT, for their ease of public access to Michael's reflections at their December 2021 event, the link to which is in the show notes. But before we meet Michael, let's go back to the year 1984 to find out what was happening when he was turning 21. Steve Jobs launches the Macintosh personal computer, while Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends is broadcast in the UK for the first time. Advance Australia Fair is proclaimed as Australia's national anthem. Medicare comes into effect in Australia, and Perfect Match, what happened to Dexter? Perfect Match is launched on Channel 10, bringing in record ratings. It's a year of disasters. The devastation of the Ethiopian famine is brought into our homes via TV coverage, and Bob Geldof and friends record the charity single Do They Know It's Christmas in London to raise money to combat the famine in Ethiopia. We were listening to Stevie Wonder, Wham and Cyndi Lauper. Sounds like the digital channel I have on the car, on the radio. And for you, and this is for you, Mark Humphreys, musical theatre fans, Stephen Sondheim's Brilliant, and it is brilliant, Sunday in the Park with George, opened on Broadway with Mandy Patinkin and Bernadette Peters as leads. I'll put a link to Sunday in the Park with George in the show notes too. There are elections in Canada with Brian Mulroney's Progressive Conservatives winning, while in New Zealand, Bob Muldoon calls a snap election and is defeated by Labor. In the US, Ronald Reagan wins, and in Australia, the 1984 federal election, Bob Hawke's Labor government is re-elected with a reduced majority, defeating the Liberal National Coalition led by Andrew Peacock. Locally, Neville Wran, John Cain Jr. and Sir Joby Ilke-Peterson, the boy from Kingaroy, are premiers. Well, he was actually born in New Zealand, Joby Ilke-Peterson. So Joby Ilke-Peterson lived in Kingaroy, are the premiers of New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland, respectively. And it's in 1984 when another boy from Kingaroy is having his 21st birthday. Michael Manthorpe, welcome. You heard in the introduction when we stepped back into 1984, which was the year you turned 21. What do you remember about that year, and what were you doing?
Well, Jeremy, it's really nice to make your acquaintance again after a number of years. And I do remember 1984 with some clarity and a fair bit of fondness. It was a year in which, I started the year briefly on the unemployment line. I graduated from Queensland University with an arts degree, along with thousands of other people at the end of 1983. And didn't really know what I was going to do. And so at about that time, if you wanted to get a job in any of the big government or corporate employers, you typically had to go and sit a test of some kind. So I sat the Commonwealth Public Service test and the State Public Service test and the Telecom test and the Commonwealth Bank test and various other tests to see whether someone would employ me.
You tested out.
And the first person that came along to offer me a role was the Commonwealth Public Service in the guise of what was then called the Public Service Board, and they offered me a base level job in the Brisbane office. So therefore I got my first job, first full-time job post university, and then later in the year moved to Canberra around about September or October, and have been here ever since, and have had a full and interesting time.
Can we quickly just reflect upon your night of your birthday? Do you remember much of it? Was it at home in Kingaroy, in Brisbane? And what were you looking forward to in life?
Yeah, well, my birthday, look, I don't remember that much about it, to be perfectly honest. But there were two events, I think. There was a little event with my mum and dad in Kingaroy, went out to dinner at one of the motels, restaurants. Just a little family gathering and a gathering with some mates in Brisbane. I think from memory, we went to a venue that I presume has long since closed called JoJo's. Everyone used to say, meet you at JoJo's, somewhere on Queen Street Mall there. Anyway, a bar. And we had some fun, but I don't remember much more about it. I don't think anything terribly amazing or terrible happened. It was all just a nice occasion.
What was your life plan? You'd gotten your arts degree in history and journalism. What was the thinking behind that focus, and what was your plan as you walked in to a new career in the federal public service? Yeah,
well, to say I had a life plan would be a bit of a stretch. I mean, so I'd grown up in Kingaroy, nice little town, conservative, quiet little Queensland country town. And although I had a fortunate and good, happy childhood, but in my teens, like many teens in many country towns, I thought it'd be really good to get out of here, and it'd be really good to go to university and try and take the next step to something. But I had really no idea what I was going to do. So I did an arts degree because it was a generalist degree, and I thought I could do some things that were interesting. And also, like many kids in country towns, or many kids perhaps in that generation, people would say, oh, well, you could become a school teacher or you could become a lawyer or something. A few professions were thrown up at you. And I thought, oh, well, an arts degree with a bit of history might be good. And also, I was struck by journalism at the time because I grew up in a family where both my parents, particularly my dad, were really interested in sort of public policy questions and politics. And so it was a household where people talked about politics a lot. And, of course, Kingaroy was the place where Joh Bjelke-Petersen came from. So the Premier was our local member. So there was a sort of a very, I suspect, very immature, but nevertheless an awareness of politics and the political system and the public policy space for me at a young age, and an interest and a curiosity in all of that. So an arts degree doing stuff like history and journalism seemed like a good path. Loads of people were doing journalism at the time at Queensland University. And so we were all competing for a tiny number of jobs when we came out. And so instead of taking that path, I found myself in the bureaucracy.
Do you remember day one of walking into the Brisbane office of the then Public Service Board?
Vaguely. I remember feeling like I don't know anything. And wearing
things changed, Michael, didn't they then?
Well, no, a little perhaps, but it was certainly it was interesting. It was unfamiliar, but people were kind and engaging.
Right.
I felt like, I think I can work with these folks. And the first thing I was put to work on was, I mentioned a minute ago, tests to bring people into public service. The first thing I worked on was helping a woman who ran the Equal Opportunity team to run adjusted public service tests for people with disability, with a view to assisting people with disability, if they could demonstrate appropriate merit, into jobs elsewhere in the public service. And I thought, wow, I fancy doing that for a living. It just sounded like such a great thing to do. And indeed it was part of, at that time, 84, still pretty early years of the Hawke Keating government in particular, with a big focus on public service reform and the public service leading in various ways, including with respect to notions of equality. And so for me as a kid from the bush, growing up in a pretty conservative political setting, to be working on that stuff, I just thought, wow, this is so cool. And I immediately took to it. Yeah.
At what point in time did you step back and you've had these, very positive, it sounds, early experiences in the public service and go, okay, this is actually going to be my career?
Yeah, well, that took some time. I mean, not long after I started there and I got busy doing that work and learning quickly. Yep. But not long after that, someone from the Canberra office, spotted me and said, "Oh, Michael, you've got a degree. You ought to come down to Canberra. Much more opportunity down there." And so I did that. And so that was certainly sort of pursuing a career in a very early way. And a few years later, having worked in a number of jobs in the Public Service Board and then a couple of other departments, then into the industrial relations space. As all that unfolded, I started learning, look, actually, I really like this stuff. The initial impression of finding it valuable and worthwhile continued. And I found myself regularly being asked to do new and interesting things, and gaining promotions and all that sort of stuff in my 20s. And so probably in my late 20s, I started thinking, actually, I might stick at this and do it for the long haul. About then, I guess.
Do you recall when you got your first Band 1, SES Band 1 role? How did you find out and what was your reaction? Because that was a pretty important, I guess, sliding door moment for you as you moved into the senior executive ranks. Yeah,
it is. And it is it's a big moment for anyone who is in the service and aspires to that level of responsibility and opportunity. I'd been acting in a job for a while, and so I was hoping to get it. I was conscious I'd done a good interview. I wasn't sure whether I was, the right sort of shape of person at the time, but nevertheless, when I got the job, I was absolutely thrilled and thought, right, now this is a big responsibility. But with that came some pretty scary moments, including as you would know, Jeremy, and some of your listeners may know, senior public servants routinely get called up in front of Senate committees, and some of those committees, like torrid Senate estimates committees and so on. And the first couple of times I appeared before those, I was just so nervous and so unclear about how it all worked. And it's the sort of setting where you can read what the rules theoretically are, but the conventions of the rules and the way in which people behave was new and unfamiliar to me, and I found it very, very difficult, while other aspects of the job were going fine. And so I just thought, well, if I'm going to make a go of this, I've got to figure out how to get past this challenge. And so I worked very, very hard at that and watched people who were good at it and just tried to learn the trade. That
actually is a great way of segueing into my next question. In your reflections to the IPAA in 2021, and we will put a link to that excellent interview and the transcript to that in the show notes, you talked about the importance of curiosity and, quote, the array of conundrums. I get the sense, having known you literally 20 years ago and appreciating your time again, and having read your different thoughts in different fora over the last few years, particularly in your last role, I get the sense that curiosity and problem solving, perhaps from journalism, perhaps from the conversations around the kitchen table, have been anchors to your career. So where did those traits come from and how have they anchored your leadership?
Yeah. Well, I think I've always been curious. I think that's a sort of an innate quality. And a couple of things about that. I went through my career often finding myself in situations where you're dealing with something new and different, all sorts of different subject matter, stuff to do with immigration and refugees, or stuff to do with building schools, or stuff to do with dealing with insolvent childcare companies, or whatever, or labour market policy, all sorts of things. And each day issues get thrown up in front of you that are slightly new and slightly different to what you've seen before. And so you're constantly grappling with how to respond to the issue, but also how to marshal resources and people and capability to try and address issues, how to meet the needs of the government of the day, but in a way that is going to work and is going to be appropriate and lawful and all of that. So there's just many, and dealing with many stakeholders about many things. So I just found all that intrinsically fascinating. But I also worked out that quite often you don't actually have the answers. You don't necessarily know the answer innately. It's not like you've been to do some university course that teaches you how to deal with this particular situation. You've got to work it out sort of from first principles. And so, A, I found that really fascinating, but B, I often found out that actually when you sit down with a group of people, you're not necessarily the smartest guy in the room, particularly when it comes to that topic, whatever it might be. So sometimes you know more than anyone else in the room about something, but often you don't. And so curiosity and problem solving, in my mind, go hand in hand then with how you work with others to help you achieve that effect. And if you think you can do it all yourself, you're kidding yourself. And some people don't. It will take. Some people are not as good as that as others.
That is another. It's a great answer because it goes to my next question. I wanted to reflect on two quotes. You said in your OPAA speech back in December 2021, quote, "Public service is complex and uncertain," unquote. And then that one, that's from you. And then in her book, for the former now Labor Assistant Minister for Childcare, who you worked with in that period, Maxine McHugh, said of you in her book, and I quote, that you were, quote, "terrific to work with, always calm and methodical." I thought that was spot on, given that I'd worked with you for a year or so when I was in a ministerial office, and that was probably the way I would have described you too. So my question is, throughout your career, how were you able to be calm and methodical given those complexities? And I think you've touched on a little bit about your leadership style there and those uncertainties you had to deal with.
Well, part of it's what personality you're imbued with from youth. But part of it is, I think, there's a certain discipline required about maintaining calmness and a sort of methodical approach in the face of pressure. And something else I learnt, and this goes in part to how do you bring stakeholders with you, or how do you engage with stakeholders, or how do you bring a group of staff with you to achieve an effect. Well, one way to not do that is to go completely cranky every time a difficult problem is presented to you, because you need the people around you to alert you to the problems. You want them to help you solve the problems, and particularly when you're getting to more senior levels, you need your senior people to be really good at problem solving too, and helping grapple with the problems. But if you start, going nuts at people because, or if you routinely lose focus and lose a sort of sense of methodology and a sense of calm in the challenging moments, then you severely hamstring your capacity to deal with them. And I've always thought the best leaders personify that capability. It's incredibly important, and incredibly important from the point of view of being given, if you're in a fairly senior role, given frank advice about what the heck's going on, and then in turn being able to provide frank advice to others. You really do need to hang on to notions of sort of calmness, I think. And of course, you can think more clearly if you're calm and still. And you see many people who are very, very religious, and others who.
Did you have people that, without naming names, were the people as you worked your way through the public service, particularly as you got into those executive roles, that you went, okay, I'm going to take that from their playbook or their toolkit. I won't use that. With the people, and I've never sat in front of Senate estimates. I've only, obviously, in a political context, been in a different context, but I've appeared in front of parliamentary inquiries, and it's pretty terrifying. And we're the ones providing the expert advice as, I guess, industry associations. Were there people that you looked to and you went, oh, that's a good way of doing it, or, that style really works for me?
Yes, and there were people of both kinds. I think I took the view, still do, that you can learn something from just about everybody you work with, not just those you work for, but people around you. Nearly everybody's got something in their makeup, in their life, in their history, in their skill set that is of potential value to you, or where you go, I really can see there's a bad effect here from this behaviour or that attitude or this approach. And so, I very consciously tried to take what I perceived to be the good bits from people I admire and adopt them, and try to avoid some of the downside of the less good bits without, as you rightly say, without naming names.
Yes.
But yeah, but I was always inspired by the people who could achieve big things and lead big things, but still maintain a sense of treating people decently, calm under fire, all that sort of quality.
Let's talk a little bit about how you went through. I've obviously not walked in anything near your shoes. How did you manage the stresses of your career, particularly as you got promoted and you were often the go-to person? I can almost imagine the phone ringing on a Sunday afternoon and Minister's Chief of Staff or the Minister themselves or the DepSec as you went, hi, Michael, we need you to do this. So how did you manage those stresses, knowing that particularly in some of those challenging circumstances, you were the go-to person on a major issue?
Well, I usually worked on the premise that if I was asked to do something that was perceived to be important, there must be a reason why they asked me. And generally, I'd say, yeah, I'll have a crack at that. So I had a sense, right. had a sense in those situations that someone's got confidence in you, and that gives you some comfort. So you might be working sort of solo on something, but actually you're working as part of a bigger system too. So, for example, you mentioned at the beginning that I was awarded a Public Service Medal back in 2010, and that was for work I did associated with the insolvency of the ABC Learning Childcare Centres, which was a great big mess at the time. And I was put in charge of this task force to help the government of the day work out what to do and how to avoid mass closures of these 1,000+ childcare centres, and then how to transition them into some other kind of ownership structure or transition children into other centres if they had to close and all this sort of thing. So it was a complicated set of circumstances, but the thing that was wonderful was that the then government set up just the right sort of governance that sat on top of this. Very senior ministers, very senior bureaucrats to whom I then worked. And my boss in particular, the then secretary of the department, she was wonderfully supportive in the sense of she knew I just had to be sort of let go and run and go and inquire into all sorts of different facets of this issue and grapple with all sorts of complexities. But she was always there if I needed her, So there was always this sense of I've been given license to go and work out how to do this thing, but there was support there, and that is so important. So if you just let run and there's no support, then there's a real risk you'll go falling over somewhere. But if the governance is right, and the leadership above you is right, and the people around you are right, and if you can choose the right people to have work for you, and you can get the right set of skills across a range of different facets of an issue from which you can, draw on the skills that others have got to distill a way forward, then I think that's a really that's a good formula for thinking about how to do this sort of stuff under fire, and just try to avoid panicking. No one wants, as we were talking about before, no one wants to work for someone who panics when things are difficult. And so you try, and we're all human, but occasionally we may fail, but I always try to live up to that kind of idea.
Can we change tack a little bit? You said at the IPA event, and again at IPAA event, you quote, "You'll be disappointed not to be promoted. You'll be unhappy about how your great policy idea doesn't get up. You'll put in a subpar performance in front of your minister or a parliamentary committee," unquote. So you've talked a little bit about that, about your first couple of appearances in front of Senate estimates. That resonated, that quote, with me, is not least because of obviously my experience as a staffer and now association head. But my question is, how did you deal with those things when things didn't click with you? Because you're in that environment where minister's office might, you've got the greatest policy idea in the world, and the minister says no, or there's a discussion between you and the Dep Sec or the secretary or whoever. So how did you deal with those times when things didn't click for you? And what would your advice be to people in the public service or business more generally where things don't go your way?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's life, right? I think that there will always be occasions where it doesn't go your way, and nobody escapes that reality. And so it's to me, it all came down to, okay, I've just suffered this setback. I've done something not as well as I might have hoped. I wish I'd said such and such a thing at a meeting. It might have swayed the views of some important stakeholders, but I just didn't think of making that argument, or whatever. Any number of things.
Yep.
So the view I took was, well, you can't change what you've done. You can't change the thing that's already happened. All you can do, think about, well, what can I do now? It's what you do next.
Yes.
That counts, which I think is the point I then went on to the speech that you're referring to. It's what you do next that counts.
Yeah.
And so
that's right.
And if you, take for example, that you miss out on promotion, right? You think you're due for promotion, you think you're eschewing for some job, you apply for the job, and you miss out and you're disappointed. The way you respond to that is so important. If you throw a tantrum, throw the toys out of the cot or some other image like that, you're only going to reinforce the view amongst those who made the decision not to promote you that they were right. Whereas
it's true.
If you go, okay, I'm going to swallow hard. I'm going to, you might choose to leave, you might choose to go and do something else altogether. That's fine. But if you choose to persist in the organisation you're in and hope to get the next promotion, then you've got to try and learn from what it is that you did that didn't work in that situation, and what you can do to correct for that, or grow from that. And so it's just about the sort of continuing to grow, and folks who get perennially bitter about some of those experiences. Sometimes, of course, they do have good reasons to. Don't dismiss that, but as a starting point, try to answer the question: well, what can I do now? What can I do now? What responsibility can I take now? Rather than falling into a kind of victimhood.
When I worked with you, and it was staggering when I was reaching out to you, and again, thank you for coming onto the show. It's staggering that it's been 20 years. It didn't surprise me at all, and I'll be quite honest that you'd achieved what you'd achieved, and I think there'd be a lot of people who knew you as you were on your way up through the ranks that weren't surprised at all. But you did have that grounded sense of that sense of grounded self without humility that did belie that razor-sharp ability to imbue the confidence of more senior colleagues. And I can only reflect from the minister's office I worked in. So how do you build that trust when you're in the middle with different priorities, different stakeholders, everyone wants the thing now, and you're in a role that you need to deliver, and you've got multiple opinions being delivered in multiple ways, and Michael, just get it done. How do you build that trust with your team? And I take your point about, one of those things is not losing your head in the middle of the office, and because everyone's looking to you to lead them. But how do you build that trust in an environment, like that?
Well, it depends on the circumstances and it depends on the issue. But a couple of comments that perhaps build on what I was saying before. First, I think that when you're in a kind of a junior leadership role, your bosses are going to expect you to really, really know the detail and be really, really across the nitty-gritty of stuff. As you go more senior, ministers might still expect you to know the detail on a particular issue on a particular day, and you'll brief yourself up on that. But you won't be across the whole detail of everything in your remit. And you become much more reliant on systems for ensuring you're getting alerted to the right stuff, and people, and the people that work immediately for you, and the particularly your direct reports. And something I learned along the way in this regard was just the importance of how you try to reduce the distance between you and the people who work for you. So by that I mean, so by that I mean when I was much younger, and I first got a little role for a few weeks acting in a middle management job while somebody else was on holiday, and I got an office for the first time in my life. I had an office for 3 weeks. Right? I'm sitting in this office and feeling pretty good about myself. And I walk outside of the office. Outside of the office are the 4 staff that I normally work with, but for this 3 weeks, they're working for me. And they're chatting.
Right.
And as I come out of the office, they shut up. And I think, something has happened here in the
yes.
And I said, hey, everything okay? Oh, yeah, everything's fine, Michael. It's fine. And it was the first hint of, as you make your way up leadership roles, a distance is created between you and the people that work for you. And so your task as a leader is to try to reduce that distance and try and give those people a sense that you're leading them, and sometimes you're having to make hard decisions about what they're doing, yet at the same time you're also there for them. And then, so that happened when I was quite young. Then fast forward to 20 odd, maybe 30 years, I can't remember exactly, but there was a point at which I became the Chief Operating Officer of what was then the Department of Education, Employment and Workplace Relations. So I was a Deputy Secretary and, I don't know, had 1,000 staff. And I had all the accounting people, and I'm not an accountant. And I had all the HR people, and I'm not really a HR expert. I had all the lawyers, and I'm not a lawyer. I had all the IT people, and I'm certainly not a person. And so when I went into that, I thought, so how on earth do I add any value to this? Right? And it became apparent that upwards it was about distilling what everyone was doing. But it was also about trying to knit it together into a coherent whole and ensure they were working with each other in an effective way. But it was also about showcasing them. Because if you lead in such a way that your goal is to get to a place where your people look good to the minister or to the secretary or to the stakeholders in some other place outside, inside or outside the government or wherever. If you build a reputation that you have a really good team of really high caliber people, that is first of all, it's a nicer place to work if people feel like they're valued in that way. But secondly, that's where you're going to get the discretionary effort, and that's where you're going to get the real conversations about, oh, crumbs, this has really gone wrong. We've got to talk about this problem. You just get a much more honest and real setup. And so many leaders never work out that thing. They think that their leadership is about advancing them. But if they can demonstrate that they lead in a way that advances others, it actually, funnily enough, reflects well on them.
It's right together.
Yeah, exactly. So that is how I'd answer that question.
I think you've answered the next question, but I really loved the quote in your reflections at the IPA event. So I'm going to put the question to you anyway, because there's 2 parts to it. At that IPAA event, you reflected on the first day of, and I could almost imagine, I was trying to picture you, knowing you, going, I could almost imagine Michael being in that office in Canberra. Your first day of Ombudsman, and you were asked, what kind of Ombudsman are you going to be? And according to your comments at the IPAA event, you said, you stopped and you thought, it's an interesting question. And you said something like, hopefully a good one, which I thought was quintessentially Michael. So what makes a good leader, and how has your leadership style evolved over time?
Well, I think over time, I think I've been talking about a whole bunch of qualities of leadership in the response to the last couple of questions, so I won't repeat all of that.
Yep.
But I think something that happens as you get older and more senior is that actually, and you've referred a couple of times through this interview to the fact that at times in my career, people would come and tap me on the shoulder and get me to do complicated tasks. But later in your career, or later in mine, the task seemed to evolve into something a bit different. And that was you get to a level and a place where you're more concerned with sort of organisational stewardship than you might be with single issue problems. You stop to deal with single issue problems. You stop to deal with day-to-day problems. But I think experience brings you a much better sense of perspective and a sense of a more systemic perspective on the sort of world in which you're working. And so I think that's a really important component of leadership too, because if leaders are going to genuinely, if they're going to lead sensibly, there's got to be some sort of goal, some sort of vision, some sort of strategy, some sort of higher level purpose to what they're doing. And so there's that element as well. And I think as you get to more senior levels and as you get more experienced, hopefully you build a capability to do that to complement the other sort of nitty-gritty skills and tradecraft that you've developed along the way. I think the other thing is you need to try to maintain a sort of a concern for those that work with you and for you and with whom you work, and indeed the wider, in the public service context, the wider public. I mean, where's the public good in what we're doing? Where's the public interest in what we're doing? Also needs to be front and centre. So that's a few sort of further reflections.
And in that context, and without being too personal, how did you evolve? I mean, you've gone from the wide-eyed boy from, I know it's a bad terminology, but that coming out of university into the public service. Fast forward, how do you not lose yourself as a person in those environments where when you're under pressure, as you're saying, you're under stress, you've got to keep coming back to those, I guess, core personal values, for example.
Yeah, well, what you have to do, you have to maintain. You have to keep asking yourself whether you can authentically continue to work on the issues. Part of the answer is you work hard. Part of the answer is you have to be able to, in effect, reconcile yourself and align yourself with the work that you're doing. You can't pretend to like doing, long hours on complicated problems. You actually have to. You have to sort of get something really positive out of it, and authentically engage in it. And so there's something about from time to time asking yourself, is this still what I'm called to do? Is this still the best thing for me? And of course, public servants in any jurisdiction will spend some of their time working for, in Australia, so they'll spend some of their lives working for coalition governments. They'll spend some of their lives working for Labor governments. Some individuals struggle with that. They might be more politically aligned one way or the other, and those individuals need to make difficult choices about what they're going to do. But if you can reconcile yourself to the fact, well, we have an elected government of the day and they've got a bunch of priorities, and my task is to assist to sort of refine and develop and implement those, then if that feels right, then that gives you a sort of a purpose and a way forward. But if you get to a place where you're sort of over it or cynical, that's a good time to go do something else.
Let's go back to where we started, and let's come back to where we started in terms of you being 21. What would 21-year-old Michael say to the Michael of 2023?
Probably get out on that bike and get a bit fitter, and you keep on going. I'm not sure I can think of anything more profound than that. But the 21-year-old me was a very fit, skinny lad, and so I've lost some of that.
I think that's quite. I like that answer in many ways, Michael. Anyway, And in a sentence, and to finish, and again to thank you, what would the Michael of 2023 say to the 21-year-old Michael? There you are in the restaurant in Kingaroy that night with the family as you look into the future. What would Michael say to that young man then?
Yeah, I think I'd say something like, don't be too hard on yourself, because of this stuff about things will go wrong, and just try to hold perspective on that. And perspective is actually a thing we haven't really talked about much in this conversation, but it's another thing that helps you get through challenging times. Just trying to keep some things in perspective. It's usually the work you do is not a matter of life and death. It is in some occupations, of course.
Yes,
I admire the people who deal with that all the time. I mean, I really do. But mostly in the line of work I found myself in, that you could keep some perspective and there was a way forward. But you could also sometimes build yourself up for mistakes, and we all make them. So it'd be a thing about perspective and not giving yourself too hard a time.
Some great reflections there from a very experienced, humble and reflective former senior public servant. So thank you so much, Michael, for taking the time out of your schedule to have a chat. That was very much appreciated. And again, a shout out to the folk at the IPAA-ACT for the very simple and accessible ease of access to Michael's reflections back in 2021. The notes to which are in the show notes. Thank you to you, wherever you're listening. Much appreciated, as always, for the support, and to Curse Kids and the Pooch for their support. Also, Sir Darcy and the team in Sydney from Pro Podcast Production. Great team who put the episode together for us. That's it for this episode of Dear 21-Year-Old Me. Again, thank you very much to Michael Manthorpe PSM for his reflections and also catching up with me after 2 decades when we were in that part of the world together. It seems like a long, long time ago, Canberra, and it was. That's it. Go well, stay well. Bye for now.
Thanks for joining us today. For more episodes and links, visit dear21yearoldme.com. And if you enjoyed the show, don't forget to rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts.